Being Melbourne High students, all of us are bound to have learnt a language other than English at some point in our lives. The way in which humans learn language is both fascinating and complex, which begs the question, are some languages easier to learn than others? First of all, let's take a look at what exactly is language. Language refers to the method of human communication, whether spoken or written, and involves the use of words in a structured and conventional manner.
How does the brain learn a language? We usually learn a language through a process called language acquisition. To be able to successfully use a language, one must first develop the ability to use phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and an extensive vocabulary. This can usually be done by exposing the infant in an environment where it can hear and use the language. Parts of the brain responsible for language. There are two main areas of the brain which are responsible for language. These are generally located in the left hemisphere and are called the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. The Broca's area is responsible for speech production. Due to its close proximity to the motor cortex, it sends signals to the larynx, tongue, and mouth motor areas to produce sound. The Wernicke's area is located in the upper part of the temporal lobe and is responsible for speech comprehension. Its main function is its ability to comprehend language and communicate intelligible ideas, whether it is vocal, written, or even signed using sign language. This means that during the developmental stage, these areas of the brain will be developing neurons between brain cells very frequently, helping the brain to develop the required abilities for language comprehension and production. As the child grows older, this area does not develop as frequently as it used to, due to the fact that most of the neurons it needs has already been developed. In fact, it becomes so difficult to learn first language later on in life that learning a language early on is considered a critical period. However, it is not a critical period for a second language, but rather a sensitive period, because the child has already developed most of the necessary abilities through learning their native language. How can one language be more difficult than another? The difference in difficulty between languages begins to show the older someone becomes due to the brain becoming less developmentally active. During this period, the brain will start to rely on the abilities it has previously developed from the native language in order to develop neuron pathways for the second language. A study conducted by Sophie Scott, a psychologist at the Wellcome Trust, together with colleagues from Oxford and London, performed brain scans on volunteers as they listened to their native language. What they found is that Chinese speakers utilizes both left and right temporal lobes, while English speakers only use the left temporal lobe. From this we can conclude that different languages utilize the brain differently, which means that languages that utilize the brain similarly to their native language will become easier to learn, while languages that are not very alike will be more difficult.
There are around 7,000 languages being spoken around the world today. Every language in the world can be organized into groups of language families. The languages are grouped based on common parent languages. The language families with the most speakers are Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, Niger-Congo, Austronesian, and Afro-Asiatic. Due to the fact that these languages are the descendants of common parent languages, an example being English and German, both descending from a language called Proto-Germanic, they often contain similar sound patterns, including things such as intonation and stress patterns, and share some vocabulary as well. Obviously, German is somewhat different to English, though it is clear that the two languages are much more closely related than, say, English and Japanese.
For example, native English speakers will find German to be easier to learn compared to Japanese, as German is more closely related to English than Japanese is. Similarly, a native Japanese speaker will find both English and German to be difficult to learn, compared to Chinese, which is a language that is somewhat related to Japanese. This can be due to a variety of factors within a language, such as vocabulary, grammar, phonology, writing systems, etc. The reason why it is difficult to learn a second language that is not closely related to a native language at an older age is because the brain has not yet developed the necessary abilities in order to speak or comprehend that language. The brain may also take longer to develop these abilities due to a decrease in brain plasticity, or in some cases not be able to develop these at all. For example, a native Japanese speaker who only speaks Japanese will find it difficult to pronounce the letters R and L in the English language, as in the Japanese language these phonemes are mixed, and that sound R and L are simply variations of that one phoneme. However, for us native English speakers, R and L are distinguished and different from each other. This means that if a native Japanese speaker wishes to pronounce R and L correctly, they'll need to develop the ability to both comprehend and pronounce these two sounds as individual phonemes, which can be difficult for those who are older and with less developmentally active brains.
A constructed language is essentially an artificial language. That is, it did not develop naturally over time, but was created consciously by a person. For example, Esperanto is a constructed language that was created by L.L. Zamenhof in 1887. For this project, Mark and I chose to see whether or not a child could successfully learn a constructed language and the effects of doing so. As it turns out, a child is able to successfully learn a constructed language. As of the 2 million people who speak Esperanto worldwide, there are about 2,000 native speakers who learnt the language from birth. Studies even show that people who learn Esperanto as a second language will find it easier to learn third or even fourth languages in the future. However, there is also evidence to suggest that this may depend on the child's environment. For example, Diarmaid Spears, a linguist, once tried to teach his son Klingon, a constructed language from Star Trek, only talking to him in Klingon for 3 years after his birth. However, his wife and others still spoke to the child in English. At first, the child would sometimes respond to him in Klingon, but would primarily still use English. As he grew older, he eventually stopped responding to Spears when he spoke to him in Klingon, which is when Spears abandoned the project. Now the child is in high school and no longer can speak Klingon at all. One of the proposed reasons as to why he did not successfully learn Klingon was that there were more people he could converse with in English, and used English much more frequently than Klingon. The fact that the child was at first able to use a few Klingon phrases might mean that if there were more people that spoke to it in Klingon, then maybe he might have been able to become a fluent speaker of the language.
In conclusion, a variety of factors will need to be considered first before determining which language will be more difficult than others. A young child will find almost any language to be of similar difficulty so long as they have enough exposure in an environment where they can develop their abilities to comprehend and produce the language. However, if someone decides to learn a second language after a sensitive period, then their native language and how much it relates to the language that they are trying to learn will be the main deciding factor to its difficulty.
Created using Powtoon.